I never meant for any of this to happen. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have sworn my life was simple, predictable, and perfectly under control. But that was before everything unraveled, before I realized how lonely a relationship can feel when the person you love doesn't love you the same way anymore. My name is Ethan Rivera, a junior studying media arts, and I used to believe that being with Noah Bennett was the best thing that had ever happened to me. Noah was charming, admired, and confident in ways I never managed to be. When he held my hand, I felt like the world finally saw me. But lately, our connection had stretched thin, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. That we didn't fight. That would have required passion. Instead, we avoided the truth with small, polite conversations that carried no warmth. Noah was always working, always busy, always too tired. He kissed me out of habit, not desire. And every time his phone lit up during our dates, I felt myself shrinking a little more inside. Still, I stayed, convincing myself it was just a phase. Then Liam Hayes crashed into my life, literally, when he tripped over a suitcase while moving into my apartment. Sorry. I swear I'm usually coordinated, he laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. There was something disarming in his smile, unguarded and sincere. He was the kind of person who wore his heart in his eyes without caring who noticed. Liam was everything Noah wasn't. Openly gay. Unapologetically loud. He filled a room like sunlight fills a window. And unlike Noah, he asked questions and actually listened to the answers. At first, I kept my distance. I wasn't ready to explain why the framed photos on my nightstand showed Noah standing just far enough for me to appear like a friend rather than a boyfriend. I wasn't ready to admit that even in pictures, we didn't truly look like a couple, yet Liam's presence was magnetic. On mornings when I dragged myself out of bed, exhausted from overthinking, he already had coffee brewing, exactly how I liked it. He'd claim it was no big deal, just an extra mug. But kindness like that felt rare. Dangerous, even. We developed an easy rhythm. Shared dinners when Noah canceled again. Quick laughs between classes. Jokes whispered in the kitchen at midnight so the neighbors wouldn't complain. Every moment felt like a secret the universe hadn't decided whether to punish or protect. One night, as we washed dishes together, Liam asked casually, "So, are you seeing anyone?" I froze. Soap slid from my hand and splashed into the sink. The silence between us thickened. Yeah, I finally said, my voice barely audible. His name's Noah. Liam didn't pry. He didn't tease. He simply nodded, though his expression shifted, just slightly. Disappointment? Confusion? I wasn't sure, but the air felt different afterward. I caught myself noticing things I wasn't supposed to, how his hair curled when he stepped out of the shower, how his laugh echoed down the hallway, how his eyes softened when he looked at me longer than he should. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself I was loyal, but loyalty feels fragile when you're starving for affection. Why best friend Chloe saw right through me. "You're glowing when you talk about Liam," she said, nudging me during lunch. "And Noah? He's barely a sentence anymore." I rolled my eyes, but her words sank in like stones. I wasn't ready to confess that I had started to crave the life I imagined with Liam, one where I didn't have to hide my relationship, or myself. A life where love wasn't rationed out like a privilege. One quiet evening, the power flickered out from a storm raging outside. Liam lit a candle, its flame dancing between us as rain hammered the windows. The shadows made the apartment feel smaller, more intimate. He shared stories about past heartbreaks, people who left once the excitement faded. His voice trembled, and I felt something inside me shift. I wanted to reach for his hand, to tell him I understood that fear all too well. My heart leaned forward before my body could, but I stopped myself. I couldn't cross that line, not yet. As I lay awake that night, staring into the dark, I finally admitted the truth, if only to myself. This wasn't innocent anymore. Something dangerous had already begun. At exactly 10 a.m., I stood outside Daniel Brooks's office, my hand hovering inches from the door. Through the frosted glass, I could see his silhouette, still, composed, waiting. I had imagined this moment all morning, but no version of it had prepared me for how small I felt standing there. I knocked once. "Come in," Daniel said, his voice even, familiar, and suddenly too intimate. The office looked the same as always. Clean desk, neatly stacked files, a framed photo turned slightly away from view. Daniel gestured to the chair across from him, then closed the door himself. The click of the lock echoed louder than it should have. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he leaned against the desk, folding his arms, studying me with an expression I couldn't read. Not angry. Not amused. Just deliberate. I read the attachment, he said, the words landed cleanly, without accusation, which somehow made them worse. I'm so sorry, I blurted out, the apology rushing ahead of thought. It was a mistake. It wasn't meant for you. I wasn't thinking, and if this affects my job, I understand. I never meant to make you uncomfortable. Daniel raised a hand gently, stopping me. Ethan, breathe. I did, though it felt like dragging air through water. I'm not calling HR, he continued. And I'm not firing you. Relief washed over me so quickly it almost hurt. But it didn't last. His gaze held mine, steady and searching, as if he were deciding how much truth to allow into the room. You wrote very honestly, Daniel said. Painfully so. Heat crept up my neck. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. The silence stretched, thick with things unsaid. I expected him to lecture me about boundaries, professionalism, ethics. Instead, he surprised me. I should never have read past the first paragraph, he admitted. But I did. I looked up then, startled. Why? I asked before I could stop myself. Daniel exhaled slowly and finally sat down. Because it didn't feel fictional. It felt familiar. My pulse quickened. This wasn't the direction I had prepared for. He continued carefully, choosing each word as if it carried weight. You didn't do anything wrong by having feelings. What matters is what we do with them. I swallowed. I don't expect anything from you. I never did. I just needed somewhere for it to go. I know, he said quietly. That's what scared me. Daniel leaned back, eyes drifting briefly to the window before returning to me. I've been married a long time, he said. Michael and we're solid. Stable. But stability can become silence if you're not careful. The mention of Michael grounded me. This was real. This wasn't fantasy. I shouldn't have let myself wonder if the letter was about me, Daniel added. And yet, I did. The admission settled between us like a third presence. I don't want to cross a line, I said quickly. I don't want to be that person in your life. I don't either, Daniel replied. That's why this conversation ends here. He straightened, professional again, the distance returning inch by inch. We'll keep things appropriate. Respectful. Nothing changes. I nodded, though something inside me resisted the finality of his words. I had hoped for clarity, but what I felt instead was an unsettling mix of relief and loss. As I stood to leave, Daniel spoke again. Ethan. I turned. For what it's worth, he said, his voice lower now, less certain, you're not invisible. The sentence lingered long after I left his office. Back at my desk, I tried to focus, but the world felt altered, as if a quiet door had been opened somewhere inside me. Daniel kept his distance for the rest of the day, professional to the point of restraint. Yet every time our eyes accidentally met, there was something unspoken there, a shared awareness that hadn't existed before. The letter had been a mistake. The conversation had been necessary. But the feeling that followed, subtle, electric, unresolved, told me this wasn't over, not even close. After that meeting, Daniel Brooks became careful in ways that were impossible to miss. He no longer lingered near my desk, no longer asked about my evenings or commented on my music playlists playing softly through my headphones. On the surface, everything had returned to normal. But normal, I learned, could feel louder than chaos. I told myself the distance was healthy. Necessary. And yet, I felt it like a withdrawal. Days passed. Then a week. I began to believe that the moment in his office had been contained, folded away like an embarrassing memory. I focused on work, stayed late, avoided situations where we might be alone. I was determined to prove, to him and to myself, that I could move on. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed while I was washing dishes. Daniel, I hope this isn't inappropriate. I just wanted to check in. Are you okay? I stared at the screen longer than I should have done. I typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on something safe. Ethan, I'm fine. Thank you for asking. A pause. Then, Daniel, good. I've been thinking about that conversation. I wanted to make sure I handled it right. The message felt heavier than its words. He hadn't needed to text me. That choice mattered. From there, the exchanges remained sparse but deliberate. A message every few days. Never overt. Never explicitly personal. Yet each one carried a quiet intimacy, as though we were speaking in a language only we understood. We never referenced the letter directly, but it lived between us, shaping every sentence. At work, we maintained our professionalism. But small things changed. When Daniel handed me a report, his fingers brushed mine and stayed a second too long. In meetings, he addressed me more often, trusting my opinion in ways that made my chest tighten with a mix of pride and guilt. One night, the text stretched later than usual. Daniel, do you ever wonder who you'd be if you made different choices? I knew what he was asking without him saying it. Ethan, all the time that he didn't reply right away. When he did, it was longer than usual. Daniel, Michael and I have built a good life. But sometimes I feel like I became responsible before I became honest. I set my phone down, heart racing. This wasn't casual conversation anymore. This was confession that I should have stopped it. I knew that. Instead, I answered, Ethan, being responsible doesn't mean you stop wanting things. The typing indicator appeared, disappeared, then returned. Daniel, that's what scares me. After that, I became something I hadn't planned to be, his quiet refuge. He never complained about Michael, never spoke with resentment, but the absence in his words was unmistakable. He talked about feeling unseen, about the pressure of always being composed, about how exhausting it was to never admit doubt, and I listened. Listening felt harmless. No one was being touched. No vows were being broken, at least not physically. That's what I told myself. But emotionally, I was stepping into a space that wasn't mine. The line finally blurred one evening when we both stayed late to finish a project. The office was nearly empty, lights dimmed, the city glowing faintly through the windows. Daniel stopped by my desk, leaning against the partition. You did great work on this, he said. Thanks, I replied, looking up. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt charged, fragile. Daniel reached out, adjusting the corner of a paper that didn't need adjusting. His hand hovered close to mine, close enough that I could feel its warmth. He pulled back quickly, as if burned. I should go, he said. Daniel, I started, not knowing what I intended to say. He met my eyes then, and for the first time since the letter, he didn't hide what he was feeling. It wasn't desire alone. It was conflict. Longing tangled with restraint. Good night, Ethan, he said softly. I watched him walk away, knowing something irreversible had already happened. We hadn't touched. We hadn't kissed. But I felt the weight of it settle into my chest all the same. That night, I lay awake, realizing the truth I had been avoiding. This was no longer just my secret. It was ours. The shift didn't happen all at once. It arrived quietly, disguised as restraint. Daniel Brooks stopped texting first. When I messaged him, his replies were polite but brief, stripped of the warmth that had once lingered between words. At work, he became distant in a way that felt deliberate, as if he were building walls where doors had been left ajar. I told myself this was the right outcome, that boundaries, once redrawn, would heal everything. Instead, they made the absence louder. I noticed the tension in him before anyone else did. The way his jaw tightened during meetings. The way he stared at his phone and then set it face down, untouched. Whatever was happening in his life had reached a point where silence was no longer enough to contain it. One afternoon, as I gathered my things to leave, Daniel appeared beside my desk. Can we talk? He asked quietly. The request alone set my pulse racing. We didn't go to his office this time. Instead, we stood in the break room, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between us. Daniel looked tired. Not overworked, burdened. Michael knows something is wrong, he said without preamble. The name landed heavier than before. I nodded, unsure what to say. I haven't told him about you, Daniel continued. Not specifically. But he feels the distance. He always has. Guilt settled in my stomach, slow and heavy. I never wanted to cause problems in your marriage. I know, he said. That's the problem. Daniel leaned against the counter, eyes fixed on the floor. What started as curiosity became something else. Something I didn't plan for. And now I have to decide who I am when things get complicated. The room felt too small for the truth he was admitting. I can't keep doing this, he said finally. Even like this. Especially like this. I swallowed. Are you asking me to step back? I'm asking myself to, Daniel replied. And that means you'll feel it too. There it was, the end I had sensed approaching but wasn't ready to face. That we stood in silence, the weight of what we hadn't done pressing just as hard as if we had crossed every line. Emotional closeness had consequences, I realized, even without touch. Especially without it. I should probably look for another position, I said quietly. A transfer. Or something. Daniel's head snapped up. No. I don't want you punished for my lack of restraint. This isn't punishment, I said. It's clarity. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded, reluctantly. If that's what you need. It was why last day came faster than I expected. Word spread that I'd accepted an opportunity elsewhere, and people offered congratulations without knowing what they were really acknowledging. Daniel kept his distance, professional to the end, though his eyes followed me more than once when he thought I wasn't looking. On my final afternoon, I found an envelope on my desk. Inside was a single note, written in Daniel's precise handwriting. You reminded me of parts of myself I had forgotten. I wish the timing had been kinder. Take care of who you are becoming. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. I never replied. Weeks later, in my new job, I found myself breathing easier than I had in months. The ache hadn't disappeared, but it had softened into something reflective rather than raw. I thought about Daniel sometimes, about the road he chose, about the one he didn't. I hoped he found honesty, whatever that looked like for him. As for me, I learned something I hadn't expected. Wanting someone unavailable doesn't make you foolish. Staying when you know the cost does. The letter I never meant to send changed my life, not because it was read, but because it forced me to read myself more clearly than I ever had before, and sometimes, that's the truest consequence of all.